This is Malka Incorporated, and in this video we're going to be talking about furry inflation and why I think there's some cause for concern. Everything you're going to see here is a version of a panel I previously presented earlier this year at both Vancouver and Finlandia. You'll see the same statistical results, and for a sense of verisimilitude and a sense of really being in the room at a convention panel, I'm wearing a loud cowbell, which is going to clank sometimes while I move my arms while I'm talking. I've updated the slides a little bit for this YouTube video to make it more binational, to include both Canada and the US. One thing, of course, that we're really missing right now is an ability for you to discuss the results in real time. That's a cool part of panels that just doesn't work the same way on YouTube. But if you'd like to talk about this further, feel free to leave a reply, because I think this is important and worth following up on. So, in this presentation, we'll be talking about what inflation is and how we measure it in the broader economy, and then zooming in on the specific case of furry inflation. I would argue that furry art is a really unique case when we think about how prices change over time, and it's something that's worth investigating and appreciating, even outside the context of being a furry. From there, I'm going to talk about a large data set I collected of furry art prices. I'm going to talk through how I use some statistical modeling to back out the inflation rate for furry art, and then I'll share the results and discuss them in some detail. All of this is preliminary. The data set is super noisy, but I think that there's some suggestive results in here, at least, that are probably cause for alarm for the future health of the community. First off, just so that we're on the same page, inflation is the rate at which the price of goods and services rises over time. Earlier in the 20th century, sometimes this was really high, prices were increasing 10 or 15% a year. More recently, central banks have learned how to stabilize that, and in fact, in a country like Canada or Mexico, all the central bank is really trying to do is stabilize prices. It's more complicated in, for example, the US or the EU. But for most of our lives, I think most people watching this video have enjoyed low inflation rates around 2%, maybe with that big spike in overall inflation rates in the COVID era. And we're going to be comparing specifically the price of furry art over time in this video. When we think about the overall economy, incidentally, how economists are literally measuring things, the Bureau of Labor and Statistics or Statistics Canada literally going out there, checking websites, or sending out minions to grocery stores or places like that to find the prices of specific items. And these categories get really specific. The requirements that these minions have to meet when they're looking for the products are really specific. And then they kind of add everything up over a basket of what people spend money on to get a single number for the entire economy. And obviously, in that basket of items they track, there's a lot of very niche items. Furry art, commissioned art, anything like that in general are not in there. And on one hand, that kind of makes sense. This is not a huge part of the economy, but I think it's actually worth appreciating why furry inflation in particular is interesting and worth studying. First and foremost, not to sound a little bit sentimental about this, but furry art and the ability to pay someone to generate this avatar for yourself, that is the core of furry expression. And so I would argue that the whole furry culture relies on a system where artists are compensated for the art they create that people use to express themselves. But more broadly, outside that kind of sentimental attachment I personally have, this is a really rare example of a unique item that is not an investment good, right? Most unique things in the world, like a dinosaur skeleton or a yacht or a gemstone or an old oil painting, these are beautiful things people buy to use and appreciate or whatever, but also people kind of bear in mind a resale value when they buy them. Furry art doesn't really have a resale value. Commissioned art is often very unique, very personal, and for that matter, distributed freely online. So it's a unique, specific, one-of-a-kind item that someone's paid money for that has no resale value. And there actually aren't that many examples of goods like that in our overall economy. Finally, and this is something that's personally interesting to me about measuring furry inflation, we can follow the career of an individual artist over time. Right. So when we think about other goods and services in the economy, it's really hard to track the specific attributes, the huge range of variety available, right? And you might say, okay, is the price of burgers rising because burgers are getting more fancy and more specific, or is that just inflation? With furry artists, we can track the identity of an artist over time, which gives us way more control over the individual flavor. This also introduces some cool new statistics problems. We'll get to that later in this video. When I was thinking about how I was going to put this panel together, I was thinking, where can I get a whole lot of data from an individual artist posting the same kind of thing over and over time. I want to be able to look back in history really far. I want to be able to search and ensure that I found everything from a given artist. And my first thought was, I'm just going to scrape for affinity. I'm going to grab all the price sheets I can find on there, and I'm going to do a panel on that, and it's going to be automated and quick. And incidentally, this is the only piece of furry art in this entire video, is this Fur Affinity banner from earlier this year, which I thought was pretty cute. But the rest of this is all just going to be graphs, sorry in advance. Unfortunately, furry artists do not post things in any kind of standardized way, even for the same artist over time. We get these price sheets that have really irregular ways of describing things. They might have a background or not. They use kind of inconsistent terminology to describe what they're doing, discounts at various times. I realized what I was going to have to do was just manually go through a bunch of price sheets and record the price of, and I chose to record the price of the most prestigious thing, right? Their full body shaded art, or whatever was equivalent. The fanciest thing that they sold that didn't have a per hour price or like per additional complexity price to it, that was what I recorded. And I tried to keep that consistent within artist over time. And this is time consuming. I start doing this and I realize, like, oh my gosh, this panel is going to, and this is right before Vancouver, this panel is going to take me like dozens of hours just to collect the data for. How am I going to do that? Then the startup I worked for got bought out and laid everyone off. And so suddenly I had dozens of hours to manually collect data. This was actually a pretty meditative experience, I will say. It was fascinating to go so far back in the Fur Affinity archives that people were saying, if you want the high-res version of the file, let me know and I'll mail it to you on disk. It was cool to see things like fan trolls rise and fall. I'm sure many of you remember that era. And, some aspects of this process were kind of sobering, like watching someone switch between Russian orthography and Ukrainian orthography when the war started in their home country. I've been a furry for a really long time. It was kind of an intense trip down memory lane to go through more than a decade of price sheets, even if I was just harvesting one number from each one. You might think that this process of just manually harvesting a single prestige price has some issues. You might be formulating those issues right now. I'm going to give you a second to take a deep breath, and on a count of 3, I want you to yell the biggest problem you see with my data collection process at the screen. 1, 2, 3. Thank you. I'm aware. This is not a perfect process, right? I have just looked for as many price sheets as possible, copied down as many prices as possible. In the end, I end up with about 2,050 prices from about 560 artists. Is this really the right data set to be using? I'm honestly not sure, but this is the data set I have, and given that I'm collecting it manually, there's not much I can do about all the rough edges. With that aside, here's kind of a summary of what the data set looks like. Collection stopped early in 2026, which is why that bar is a lot smaller. We have meaningful data going back to about 2009. Before that, it gets really sparse. Most artists only give us 2, 3, or 4 price sheets. A few of them give us dozens of price sheets to work from. And when you think about it, if we're trying to track what's happening over time to the same artist, it is super useful when we have 40 or 50 price sheets from the same artist. Unfortunately, that's rare, and we end up having to work a lot off the artists for whom we only ever see 2, 3, 4 prices. More on that in a bit. And to give you a sense of what it looks like, what this data set actually looks like, each of these lines is a different artist's prices over time. And in general, they tend to go up, but sometimes they go down. In general, the first price tends to be a little bit lower than subsequent prices because people are kind of trying to figure out what works. There's a lot of noise. There's a lot of learning. Furry artists are their own businesses, right? People are trying to just figure out what the price should be of their own accord, and sometimes the guesses they make at first aren't right, but they figure it out over time. For many artists, there does end up being kind of a long-run price they go with, but for others, it just keeps on going up. So the average artist in our dataset increases their prices by 27% a year. There are some outliers, as you can see in the graph on the right. Some artists actually lower their prices on average year over year, and some more than double their prices on average year over year. What's going on here, right? Like, some of this might be artists' skill increasing over time, or like notoriety, popularity increasing. Part of it is inflation, which is what we care about today. This huge range of price adjustments and those like outliers where people are doubling and tripling their prices suggests that there's maybe scope for future videos just on artist life cycle and the idea that artists learn about pricing and get better at art. Today we're going to be trying to get that out of our data using statistics so that we can focus on inflation in particular. And to give you a sense of how noisy things are, in case that wasn't clear yet, we can see artists who've posted, maybe half a dozen different prices over time. Some of them, prices are just ticking up the whole way. Some of them immediately find the right price and then stick with that. And then others kind of started out with the price they were going to use and didn't really adjust upward, even as inflation rates were really high in the overall economy. There's a lot of different trajectories going on here, and hopefully this illustrates why we need to do a little bit more thinking and a little bit more statistics to capture what's going on. Here's the kind of conceptual mental model I'm using for what goes into how artists price art. It's some combination of like the price level for furry art in the overall market. There's the artist's specific flavor, which might be like, I only draw Sonic, or I only draw My Little Pony, or I only draw big elaborate, lifelike portraiture. There's the artist's skill level. That can change over time. There's the FX rate, because artists are posting these in all different currencies. And then there's some amount of measurement error that just comes from like, artists have taken down some of their prices over time, or I made a mistake entering things, or just like other sources of noise. And if we take the logarithm of everything, we end up with this formula here, where we have a bunch of additive terms, one of which we care about, one of which, the artist's flavor, I think is probably constant over time, right? An artist who does a given thing is going to keep doing that specific thing, or if not, they're going to start a new profile for the new thing. An artist's skill level. When I say skill level, I mean both skill at art and also skill at things like marketing and pricing. And then a bunch of stuff that I'm just going to say, that's noise. But the tricky part here, and I think the thing that is unique to furry art when we think about the prices of goods, is that we can track the flavor of art that a specific artists make over time. That's cool, that's unique, that's a level of differentiation we don't really get anywhere else. But also there's this skill component where an artist might be getting better at stuff over time, and we need to separate that out so that we can isolate the changes in the price level, right? We can isolate inflation, because that full 27% price increase we discussed previously probably includes both of these things. To make that jump and to separate out the artist's skill and the artist's flavor from the inflation information from that change in the price level, we need to make some pretty big assumptions. The first one is that learning happens in the same rate at all eras in our data set. So, the amount of experience you get drawing art for all of 2015, and the amount of experience you get for drawing art for all of 2019, and the amount of experience you get for drawing art of all of 2025, each of those 1 years of experience, no matter where they are in time, is equally valuable. I think this is reasonable. I don't think the tools have changed that much. I don't think the norms of marketing for furry art have even changed that much either. The second big assumption is that artists need to keep the same flavor of art over time. That is, if you draw Sonic art, you always draw Sonic art. And you don't say, okay, Sonic is not popular anymore, I'm going to pivot to drawing My Little Pony art. If you're doing that, and those different flavors of art just have very different price points, that's going to be hard to differentiate from inflation, and I think we would end up in some situations where people strategically switching between different styles of art could make it look like prices were increasing faster than they really were. Finally, we need to assume that FX rates, that is, the exchange rates between currencies, are random. I think this is fine. I am not here to model how currency exchange rates vary over time. They're probably pretty random. This feels like a question for a very different YouTube channel. So once we make these assumptions, we can go back to that previous expression. We can effectively throw out the FX information. We can model learning is happening at the same rate over time. And we can average out a single flavor for each artist over time. And just isolate the price level. That is the ambient price of furry art in the overall economy at a given time. And here's how that ends up looking. The thick green line here is the furry art price index. That is the ambient level of furry art pricing. The shaded region is the confidence interval. That is, that's our uncertainty bound. As you can see, the prices are ticking up over time. I don't go any further back than 2015 here because data starts to get really sparse. The earlier data does get used to try to model how artists learn over time, but the error bars absolutely blow up as we go further back in time, and it gets really hard to say anything about the ambient price level when we're only recording maybe a dozen transactions a month or even fewer. So this is how things look over the past decade for the ambient price level for furry art in the economy. And the rate of change of this over time is the inflation rate. This is the rate at which the price of furry art is increasing over time. Here I've put everything in annualized percentage terms. You will see that these numbers are much higher than the 2 or 3% that goods in the overall economy are going up by, with one recent exception, and that is the last few months where the price of furry art has actually fallen for the first time since we started collecting data. That's surprising. This is a medium that previously had, double-digit inflation rates, right? Prices were going up by double digits a year. And more recently, it started decreasing. What could be going on there? I think the main takeaways here, are that prices generally have been going up over the past decade. We can think about many reasons that's happening. I've listed some here. Another one might just be like, there's so much money in tech these days. There's this whole class of furries with just infinite disposable income. We also saw a big spike in the 2020s during the era of high inflation. But I think the part that I'm the most interested in is what's happening in the last, let's say, 6 to 12 months. Prices have fallen, and in fact, the change in prices has gone negative. And when you think about what's happened over that period, one really notable innovation has been the rise of LLMs that can produce very elaborate images. And I think a lot of people watching this, and definitely people who came to the panel in person, are the kind of deeply embedded members of the furry community who would never think about using generative AI to make furry art for themselves. But there's a whole tier of kind of casual furries who maybe wouldn't see the problem and maybe see the idea of talking to an artist as daunting and would rather generate their own art using, LLMs that scraped a bunch of other people's art and now generate new linear combinations of that. I sure hope that's not what's happening. At the same time, that decrease in prices recently is really noteworthy. I think more time and more data is going to help answer this question. Speaking of which, data collection is ongoing here, and if you have any sense of how I could potentially automate this, I would love to hear about it. For that matter, let me know if you'd like to see more YouTube videos about the economics of being a furry, or furry art commissions in particular. I think this is a really cool area. It matters a lot to me, and I would be happy to talk about it more. That's all for now, and maybe I'll see you at a convention or in a future video.